So a little bit about who we are and some of the backstory of the genesis of our organization. The Cape Cod Modern House Trust was founded in 2007. Its mission is really threefold. The first is to collect, archive, and share documentation of the Outer Cape's exceptional modern architecture. Number two, to restore a group of important endangered modern houses. And number three, to relaunch them as platforms for new creative work. So let's start with a place. This is Cape Cod, which is a unique landscape of beaches, pine woods, tidal marshes, and glacial ponds. Starting in the late 1930s, the Outer Cape, which is at the northeastern end of it, also attracted some of the prime movers of modern architecture. This was the summer Bauhaus in 1937. And this picture shows Walter Gropius in the middle with the hat, flanked by Santi Shavinsky, Herbert Bayer, who was the graphic designer that gave the Bauhaus its visual style. Marcel Breuer's in there, he's kind of hidden in the back. And Mary Koss, who went on to be a curator of architecture at the Museum of Modern Art. So, while at the same time the summer Bauhaus convened, a young Boston Brahmin named Jack Phillips inherited 800 acres of land on the Outer Cape. So Jack Phillips was the son of an American elite family that went back to the 17th century. And having gone to Harvard Architecture School in the late 30s, he became friends with and later sold parcels of land at around $25 an acre to architects like Serge Chermayeff, Marcel Breuer, and Paul Weidlinger, who built summer residences there in the 40s and 50s. And this is a picture of that land in the 1930s, which at that time, the Cape was really considered a mosquito swampland and pretty rugged territory. It took a full day to get there from Boston at the time. And on the right, you can see the Atlantic Ocean and one of the kettle ponds, I believe that's Horseleech Pond, which is in the town of Wellfleet. So this house was built by Jack Phillips on that piece of land in 1938. It was the first modern house built on Cape Cod and completely clad in homosote. So at the time, homosote was an innovative wallboard made of pressed paper, and it was considered the first American construction product made of recycled material. The house infamously later became known as the Paper Palace. So it's not a great idea to clad a house in homosote, just FYI. I don't think it takes an architect to figure that out. It was later clad in cedar clapboard. So from there, I just want to talk a little bit, just digress for a moment, about this idea of kind of informal building materials, which embraced the idea of recycled or salvaged material, and that really ran through the Cape architecture from the 17th century through the mid-20th century. And it's kind of a version of Yankee thrift, to reuse materials and maximizing what you have at hand. So in keeping with this spirit, this is a post and beam barn that was rebuilt with wood from another derelict barn from the early 40s. This picture is of the schooner Fortuna, which wrecked in 1894 on the treacherous northern tip of Cape Cod. And wreckers would, pick clean the bones of these wrecked ships, which at the time was a renewable resource, with some 2 disasters every year during the age of sail. This is a famous example of adaptive reuse. The troupe that became the Provincetown Players staged its earliest public performance in this 19th century fish house in 1915. The building seated 90 people and launched the career of Eugene O'Neill as a playwright. So I wanted to just talk about these slides because it illustrates some of the vernacular architecture of early Cape Cod, which was influential on much of the modern work that took root there in the 40s and 50s. And one of the architects who was really influenced by these local buildings was Marcel Breuer. So one summer day in the early 1940s, Marcel Breuer, his wife Connie, and their baby son drove out to Cape Cod to try and find their old friend Serge Chermayeff. The Breuers were completely smitten with how beautiful the area was, and a few months after their first visit, they bought a 19-acre plot in the backwoods of Wellfleet with the intention to build. By 1946, before a single nail had been hammered, Breuer had published a design for a colony of 5 houses on this rolling piece of land overlooking the kettle ponds in Wellfleet. So they were all based on a prototype called the Longhouse. So the one that he actually built was right here, overlooking Williams Pond, where you see that arrow. So the house was completed in 1949, and the predominant feature of the house is, to me, this bump-out porch, where you can see his wife and son sitting, and it really just floats over the hill above the pond. This is a picture taken from inside that porch, and you can see the ponds in the background, and really get a sense of almost levitating in the treetops with these incredible views in the background. This is an initial rendering of the Longhouse Prototype, which he based his houses on, and I think it really shares an affinity with a lot of the case study illustrations that we're seeing today. Breuer later expanded the concept of the Longhouse by adding a studio. So as you can see in this plan, both volumes are connected by a pergola, which expands the space significantly and in effect transforms the Longhouse into what he called the binuclear diagram. This is an example of that house, which is the Wise Residence, which is built in South Wellfleet. This detail of the porch for me is really an exceptional architectural moment. I think the simplicity and legibility of the structure is really spectacular. And I love how the framing reveals the upper struts in tension and the lower struts in compression, as you can see here. That's the upper strut and lower strut. And it really just kind of cradles this volume in a really beautiful way. So as you can see, by the late 1950s, Cape Cod was firmly established as a place where modern architecture was able to experiment, evolve, and thrive. And then something big happened. In 1961, the federal government passed a critical piece of legislation which threatened the very existence of this modern culture. In this slide, you can see the boundary of the Cape Cod National Seashore in green, which was established by John F. Kennedy in his first year in office. And at that time, the administration felt that the delicate and unique landscape of Outer Cape was in danger. And so they passed legislation to protect it from overdevelopment. So on the face of it, this was a great act of land conservation, but it wasn't an entirely uncomplicated act. Because in fact, there were at the moment many important houses under construction, those whose future were threatened. And one example of these houses is the Hatch House built by architect Jack Hall in 1961. So when the Park Service claimed these houses by way of an eminent domain, the decision didn't go down without protest, and so after quite a lot of back and forth, the compromise that was reached was that the owners of the houses in question were given 20-year leases and sometimes lifetime leases, after which control and ownership of the houses would revert back to the Park Service. So the Park Service planned to demolish these houses and erase them from the landscape, but ultimately never had the heart to do it or the money. And let's face it, the Park Service isn't in the business of maintaining houses. They're in the business of maintaining land and landscape. So as a result, these properties fell into decay and disrepair. So this sorry state of affairs continued for quite some time until 2007, which is when the Cape Cod Modern House Trust came into being, the brainchild of my friend and colleague Peter McMahon, and one of the park rangers, Director of Cultural Affairs, Bill Burke. So Peter, like me, was an architect by trade and had also grown up going to the Cape in the summers. He was passionate about these houses and felt it was his mission to save them. And so he created the trust, secured leases from the park on 3 of the most important houses, and together with myself and our board, raised money to restore and rehabilitate these houses. So this is a view of the Hatch House, really at the end of the road when its owner, Ruth Hatch, and her husband Robert had passed away. And at the time, Ruth wasn't really aware of the imminent creation of the national park. And so they gave her a lifetime lease, and she lived until 93, which was 2007. And when she passed away, the ownership of the house reverted back to the park. There's actually a very touching line from an interview I did with her where she says, "I feel obliged to live so that my kids can use the house." So the original plan of the house, which Jack Hall designed, has a rectangular grid of 35 cubic modules, or nearly cubic, each at 7 by 7 by 8 on concrete pilings. And This is a picture of the architect Jack Hall. He also liked to moonlight as a fisherman. But I want to talk a little bit about the restoration of the house and how we approached it. We built this digital model when we first started in 2011, and I just want to show you some slides that just gives you a kind of narrative of how the assembly of this house goes. It's really very interesting. There are these vertical posts, and these horizontal members making the frame, and you can see the 35 square grid. This is the decking infill, which represents the circulation between the 3 volumes of the house. So this area is the main sitting area. That's a bedroom, and that's another little separate bedroom. So a little abstract, but I think you get the idea. Walls, roof, and then these shutters, which fit inside the modules of the house. And one of the challenges when you're restoring a house like this are some of the decisions you have to make. And you can see this piling was actually built with beach sand, which is just down the path. The beach is about 200 yards away. So it was used as aggregate, and it began to really corrode in the salt air. Each post, or many of them, actually I should say, were just corroded beyond repair. So we had to create these kind of bracing systems. This is a high alloy stainless steel with bolts. And there you see the new pilings poured with J-hook embeds. We were able to kind of level the house through that process. And this is the house restored. Of you looking into the deck, looking from the beach. This is the interior. All of this, all the furnishings are original, including that pot-bellied stove, which is the only round thing in the house. Everything else is orthogonal. Kitchen, and you can see on the right some of the just artifacts that were there. It's a kind of a string of fishing lures on the right, which is one of my favorite things. This is the bedroom, and you can see the shutters sort of kind of propped open. They're very heavy, these shutters, but it really has this almost kind of cabin feel to it, which is, I think, the way that Jack Hall and Ruth Hatch wanted it to be. That's overlooking Cape Cod Bay to the west. That's the house looking above from the hill, and you really get a sense of the siting of this house. So the next house I want to talk about is the Kugel-Gips house by Charlie Zender, which was built in 1970. We obtained a lease, well, it was rebuilt in 1970. Originally it was built in 61, but got rebuilt and it was still under the ownership of the park in 1970. So we obtained a lease for this house in 2009 from the park. And it had been abandoned for 11 years. And you can see the amount of rot and decay in the lower level. This restoration was completed in 2010, and you can see the influence of Frank Lloyd Wright on Charlie Zender. The plan kind of pinwheels out from a central hearth, creating these cantilevered decks, which gives you kind of immersive experience in the landscape. And again, this house is also on a pond, so there are these really privileged sites with all of these houses. This is a winter shot of this house, which I'm showing because it's the only house of the 3 that we restored that has an enclosure that's robust enough to actually withstand the wintertime. So the third house that I want to talk about was designed by engineer and architect Paul Weidlinger in the 1950s. He began visiting Wellfleet, probably when he was commuting regularly to Cambridge to lecture at Harvard and MIT. Weidlinger Associates is still an office that exists in New York, and they specialize in structural engineering. In fact, they were hired to do an analysis of the World Trade Center collapse through a series of structural models. So he really was a very influential character in the structural world. He also worked for Corbusier for free. So this house was built in 1953, and it's pretty much like a white box floating about 10 feet off the ground and somewhat attached to the hillside next to Gull Pond. These are original interior shots taken by Paul Wadlinger's wife. And you get a sense of that floating again in the treetops, which I think is something that's common with a lot of these houses there. And just to touch on the fact of how we ended up getting involved with this house, it's an exception to the previous two houses, and I talked about in terms of its ownership history. So unlike the Hatch House and the Kugel-Gibbs House, the Wadlinger House was actually given to the National Park as a benevolent act of conservation in the 70s by Paul Wadlinger's wife. And so since the 70s, it just fell into a complete state of disrepair. A tree had fallen on the roof, and it was pretty much left for dead, this house. So the trust obtained a lease for the Wadlinger House the same year as we obtained the lease for the Hatch House, which I said was in 2011. We began the restoration process, a lot of which involved, in this case, reframing of the undercarriage, regrouting some of the lateral cable stays. And one of the decisions we made, which we had a huge debate about this, these are new triple glazed sliders that were actually given to us at a really good price from an Austrian company. And that's the house restored now. This is the interior. And you can see those big blue sliders. Those are the new windows that we put in. I think it turned out pretty well. My hesitation about it was the thickness of the actual frames, because they were a lot thinner originally, and I thought, well, that's not really going to be in keeping with the kind of refined sense of tectonics that I felt this house had. But we went ahead and did it, and I think it was a good decision. You can see the smaller sliders here on the left side. And that's the house kind of in the trees there. So last year marked the end of the renovation and restoration phase of the trust work, at least for now. And as we recover financially from that work, we're also able to turn more of our attention to other programs. So we have an artist in residence program, and we also provide tours and engage in school collaborations. This photograph was taken in 2013. We sponsored a competition that invited architects and designers to submit proposals for accessory dwellings on the Outer Cape. So the idea was to help address the shortage of middle to low income housing. And this photo was taken of the exhibit of the 5 finalists at the Boston Society of Architects. I included this photo. I love this photograph. It's 3 of the great thinkers of the Outer Cape modern movement, and they're all putting their heads together. So from left to right, you can see Bernard Rudofsky, Serge Chermayeff, and Gregory Kepish. So that tradition of putting heads together is a tradition at the Trust that we're hoping to carry on. This photograph was taken this past summer at the Chermayeff residence, and it's a symposium that we sponsored on the Cape and at Cooper Union this past fall about the state of rural communities. Some of the people involved, Kenneth Frampton, who's been a great supporter of ours, and that kind of bald guy on the right is Neil Brenner, who runs the Urban Studies Lab at the GSD. So I feel that one of the most central activities of the Trust, and arguably its most important, is to continue the discourse on activities in contemporary architecture. We're one of the only organizations on the East Coast and maybe in the country that has a residency program for architects and designers. Although I heard the Mack Foundation has one too, so I don't want to speak out of turn. And we're also really proud of the fact that we provide ongoing opportunities for outside curators and program exhibitions and symposia. So we really want the Trust to be a focus for conversations about contemporary architecture for a long time to come, and we're building towards that with these 3 amazing houses as the center of gravity for that endeavor. So I hope I've given you just a taste of what we do, and thanks very much.
questions for Malachi? Yes.
How many houses are left to restore?
Well, that's a great question. I think we're going to stop at 3 because we're just going to get into the real estate business otherwise at this point. There's actually a Breuer's first house, which is not in park territory, but it's actually under ownership of his son Tomasz. And there's a chance that we might get that house if certain financial backers can come into the picture. But 3 houses is a lot to manage, and we feel like that's a kind of good moment of stasis for us in terms of our programming. I see.
How was it all financed? Oh, yeah, would you let us know who you are, please?
Michael Liquid, Capital Down Drops. How was it all financed?
So one of the things that we do is that we actually were able to rent the houses in the summer. I think actually Natasha mentioned that. We can't advertise it, but anybody can come and stay in one of the houses during the summer months, so basically June through September. And, we were able to generate revenue from that. So that's first and foremost. Secondly, we do fundraising like everybody else. And when we originally did the restorations of the house, the town of Wellfleet has what's called a capital commission, and we were able to get money from the town as a kind of starter piece of capital to do the restorations because it's, each one of them was over $100,000, so we had to kind of, and Kickstarter was also helpful.
Another question? Yes. No other?
I thought I saw another hand, but,
Yeah.
oh, I'm sorry.
Was there another question?
No, we're out of time.
I had a question.
Yes.
What is it about that area that these houses are floating? Is there some kind of aesthetic quality, or is it a climatological issue, or so many are up in the trees and looking out at these views?
Yeah, I think the intent of the architects was to have this kind of blur, this merge with the landscape. And the landscape up there, that the scrub pines are kind of distributed in a way that it's not so dense that you feel kind of like you're claustrophobic in a forest, but there's enough sort of dappled light coming in that, with houses up on stilts like that, there's a sense of just integration, I guess, spatially with the forest. It's my sort of take on it. It's kind of,
Yeah, very distinctive.
yeah.